Thinking about that phrase, a land not sown. And one of the things that's very characteristic about the book of Jeremiah is it's full, as one writer said, it's full of a variety of words and themes and metaphors, and it's like that we talked about last week with the other prophets. It's just a collage of words, but a lot of them have both what we might call a primary meaning and then a non-dictionary meaning. Or as one writer said, and here's characteristic of Jeremiah, is Jeremiah is a mixture of poetry and prose. And you move in and out of poetry and prose. Well, in prose, you more likely expect the dictionary definition of words to be used. In poetry, you can use imagination and see where that word takes you, and with other ideas and other thoughts. Still meaningful, but expanding the meaning. And here he says, I think poetically, I took you through the desert, which was a land not sown. In other words, there were no crops growing in the desert. There were no seeds that had been planted there. And what did they do for 40 years? He said, I provided you manna. I provided you food. I provided you what you couldn't find because there was nothing sown there. You couldn't raise your own crops and make your own bread. And so for 40 years you had the experience of living in a land not sown. And he says, and you were holy to the Lord and the first fruits of his harvest. Now you'll notice there's a break there, because in my mind that's sort of the call and the introduction to the book of Jeremiah. Brueggemann also mentioned that he said in a lot of ways Jeremiah is an extension of Deuteronomy. So before we go into verse 11, in the next section, I want to go back to Deuteronomy and remind us. I've always thought if I wanted to find the Ten Commandments, where are they? And in my own little memory device, I could always remember the 10 Commandments were in Deuteronomy, the 5th book of the Bible, the 5th chapter of the Bible. And so if you add 5 and 5, you get the 10. And there's the 10 Commandments. And so, but shortly after the 10 Commandments, in the 7th chapter, listen to what is happening is described. God is saying, for you are a people holy to the Lord your God. The Lord your God has chosen you out of all the people on the face of the earth to be his people, his treasured possessions. And then it goes on, the Lord did not set his affection on you and choose you because you were more numerous than other people, for you were the fewest of people. It was because the Lord loved you. And so here's this, the Lord loved you, and then he says, and here we're seeing, he says, I remember you as a youth, and you loved me. And so we see this relationship of love existing between God and these people. And he says, the Lord loved you and kept the oath he swore to your forefathers. Then he goes on in verse 9 of chapter 7 and says, know therefore that the Lord your God is the faithful God, keeping his covenant of love to 1,000 generations for those who love him and keep his commandments. Therefore, verse 11, take care to follow the commands and the decrees that you have been given, and keep his covenant of love with you. So this is where we've moved on down through the years now, but you hear some of this memory, some of what this story being brought back to life. And then so now with that in mind, we move to the first large section, which is really generally called the judgment. This is a judgment of the people. And he says, but my people have exchanged their glory for worthless idols. Be appalled at this, O heavens. Once again, do you hear the poetry in that? Remember, the heavens declare the glory of God. That's appalling to the heavens to find that the people have exchanged this glory for worthless idols. And then he says in verse 13, my people have committed two sins. Number one, they have forgotten me, the spring of living water, and have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water. So you see what he's saying here. They forgot me and decided, we'll just do this ourselves. We'll just arrange for our own water. And so once again, you hear the poetry of the words working through here. It's water. Oh. Water for no water. And so when we finish today, as we're going through, I'm going to give you a few words that I'd like, if you have a pencil and you want to circle them, and then is glory. The third word is water. So far we've got three words that just kind of mark mentally or with a pencil. And then we move on in verse 21, and he says, I had planted you like a choice vine, a vine of sound and reliable stock. How then did you turn against me into a corrupt and wild vine? And so there's the fourth word, vine. We'll come back to that in a minute, but you see how he's setting up contrast. He's saying glory or worthless idols, and you pick worthless idols. Water or broken cisterns, and you pick broken cisterns. Vine of reliable stock or a corrupt wild vine, and you've chosen a corrupt wild vine. So after moving through this sort of description after description of vivid word pictures, he says, so in chapter 3, verse 14, return. In other words, change from those choices back to, it's as if he says, return to glory and water and a choice vine, and the choice vine. Return, faithless people. Then I will give you shepherds after my own heart, who will lead you with knowledge and understanding. At that time, they will call Jerusalem the throne of the Lord, and no longer will they follow the stubbornness of their evil hearts. Well, so you notice another contrast there. There is his own hearts and his own heart and the stubbornness of their hearts. So you get another contrast between God's heart and the stubbornness of their hearts. And so chapter 4, verse 1 says, if you put your detestable idols out of my sight and no longer go astray, and if in a truthful and just way, just and righteous way, you swear, as surely as the Lord lives, then the nations will be blessed by him, and in him they will glory. Okay, so this is one of those classic if-then statements. You know, if this, then this. And you'll notice he's got two ifs and then a then. In other words, he says, starting with chapter 4, verse 1, if you put your detestable idols out of my sight, and then just a few words later, and if in a truthful and just and righteous way you swear, as surely as the Lord lives. In other words, you restate your faithfulness, allegiance, and relationship to God. Then, here's the then. Then the nations will be blessed by him, and in him they will glory. So we move on. O Jerusalem, wash the evil from your heart and be saved. And then he goes on in 5 verse 10, go through the vineyards and ravage them, but do not destroy them completely. So we've been going through some pretty heavy judgment here, haven't we? I mean, it's just layer after layer after layer of, this is not sounding good. I remember one time in a class over at ACU, I was teaching, and I asked the students, I said, what's the opposite of hope? And one guy said, hopeless. I said, that's really good, isn't it? But it is, isn't it? And here they were. It's also despair, but they're in a hopeless place. No water, corrupt vines, worthless idols. It's hard to look around and feel good about your surroundings. And then but here is the glimmer of hope. Here is the glimmer of God's grace. Because look what he said. He didn't just say, go through her vineyards and ravage them. He didn't stop there. He says, go through the vineyards, ravage them, but do not destroy them completely. Now that's grace, because as we've talked before, grace is unmerited favor. And they certainly have not merited any favor from God at this point, have they? We've just been through a litany of embarrassments of the way they have responded in this covenant relationship. And yet God says, go through them, and even he goes on, strip off the branches. For these people do not belong to the Lord. In other words, these branches do not belong to this vine. Separate them. But then he says, but don't destroy the vine completely. So that's a glimmer of hope, a glimmer of God's grace breaking through in all of this heavy judgment. So, verse 28, their evil deeds have no limit. They do not plead the case of the fatherless to win it. They do not defend the rights of the poor. So what does that leave them? They're thinking only of themselves, he's saying. They're not paying attention. They're not being the way God is toward his people. He says they're not caring about anybody. They're not caring about the poor. They're not caring about the fatherless. Their evil deeds have consumed them. And so as we leave this section, I want us to mark the fifth word, which is branches. You notice he said, strip off her branches. some mark branches in your mind as the fifth word. And then we move on, and we've just begun to feel like there's this glimmer of hope beginning to break through, even as dark and as perilous and as hopeless as it sounds. And so then he says, so then, verse 16, stand at the crossroads and look and ask for the ancient paths. In other words, remember we've talked a lot about how much we find the journey language in the Bible. Look for the path. Ask for the ancient paths. Ask where the good way is. In other words, go back in the past and find that good way, and then walk in it. And that's the sixth word, and it's the first word that starts having a little sense of hopefulness in it, doesn't it? We've been through some pretty difficult things, but now there's a little hopeful. Here's what to do. We've been talking about what you've been doing. Now let's talk about what you should do. Ask for the ancient paths, where the good way is, and walk in it. And then he says, and you will find rest for your souls. It's even sounding like we can feel a little, like we can take a little breath, feel a little relief, some rest. Then he goes back again and says, I gave your forefathers this command, obey me, and I will be your God, and you will be my people. That's the covenant, isn't it? That's the two parts of the covenant. I will be your God, you will be my people. He said, I gave this command to your forefathers. And then walk in all the ways I command you, that it may go well with you. But they did not listen. They didn't even pay attention. And as a result, truth perished. In other words, truth became contaminated. Truth began to be compromised. Truth began to be compromised with current thought and with personal opinion. And he says, truth perished. It vanished. The real truth. It vanished from their lips. And then in chapter 8, verse 7, he says, even the stork in the sky knows her appointed seasons. And the dove and the swift and the thrush observe the time of their migration. He's saying even the birds of my creation, of God's creation, they know when to come and when to go. Isn't that interesting? When did they ever go to school to learn that? Whoever had them pick up the bird's manual on migration, and they have to study that before they know. He says they know. They know that. That's a part of how they were created. Even they know that. Once again, but my people do not know the requirements of the Lord. And so he's saying this is what's happened in history. But then he says, now to you, but you have behaved even more wickedly than your fathers. In other words, you've taken it even to another extreme. So he says, see how each of you is following the stubbornness of his evil heart instead of obeying me. Well, obviously, those are just a few passages that come all the way from chapter 2 and 3 all the way down through, as you can see, chapter 16. And really, it even goes on, because now you see there's a break, and we move to chapter 23, which many who have written on and studied the book of Jeremiah say at about this point, 23, 24, 25 different people say things change. We've been through a really dark period of despair as we move from in that span of chapters. But now we come into something, and look how we start. The days are coming. It's like we've just been looking at the past. And now we hear something about what's ahead. The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will raise up to David a righteous branch. And this is the name by which he will be called, the Lord our righteousness. So now we're getting into what is sometimes called the messianic, early messianic passages that are projecting all the way in. And by the way, this phrase, the days are coming, is repeated several times as we move on through. So it's talking about now the future. And so we've moved from judgment, really from judgment to hope, from judgment to renewal. And so the days are coming. I will raise up to David. This is the name he will be called. And then in chapter 24, I just put this little acknowledgement of another picture that he paints about the two baskets of figs, and one basket is of bad figs and the other basket is of good figs. But I put this in here because you'll notice it says, so I want you to be like these good figs. I will regard them as good exiles. In other words, he's saying everybody's going to exile out of Jerusalem and into Babylon. But then it's not like I'm going to always consider them to be all and only bad exiles. So how do they change to be good? Because God regards them as good. Once again, God's grace breaks through and says, you could just all be bad and forgotten. But we're going to see why he doesn't do that. And he says, so I'm going to regard this group. There will be a group of good figs. And it's because I regard them as good. And I will bring them, now these good, I will bring them back to this land. And I will build them up and not tear them down. Remember, this is the echoes of that very first assignment that was given to Jeremiah, to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. And so he's saying, and here's where we get into everything is not going to be torn down. Just like all those branches, all those vines are not going to be pulled up. They're just going to be, the branches are going to be torn off. But here's where I'm going to build them up and not tear them down. And this group, these that I regard as good exiles, they will be my people. And I will be their God. In other words, he's saying, I'm not giving up on the covenant. I'm not changing. I am still going to be and to do who I said I am and will do. I am the God, and I will be their God. And so you see, here's the second time now we've heard this covenant statement. We just heard it. Now here it is again. They will be my people, and I will be their God. for they will return to me with all their heart. For I know the plans," and this is a passage that many of you are probably familiar with, 29:11 from Jeremiah, where he says, "For I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and to give you a future." And he says, so these are my plans for you, and here's how you can find them. Here's how you can find them in your own life to the point that you live them out. If you will seek me and find me when you seek me with all your heart. And then we come to chapter 30, verse 2, where he tells Jeremiah, "Write in a book all the words I have spoken to you." And this little 2-chapter section, chapter 30 and 31, over the years have come to be called the Book of Comfort. And those two chapters, 30 and 31, are this comforting reassurance of the reinstatement of the covenant. That it's still, and here, if you wanted to say, what is the theme of the Book of Comfort? It's the next verse, verse 18. What better news could you have after working through what we've just worked through in that middle section to hear God say, "I will restore the fortunes of Jacob's tents"? So in other words, he's basically said, here's a pretty bad situation. I want you to return and I will restore. So now we've moved from desperation and despair to saying there's still a way out. The vine hadn't gotten pulled up. It's not gone. Return, and I will restore. So between return and restore, we get renewal. And so it's a renewal of hope. He says, "I will restore the fortunes of Jacob's tents and have a compassion on his dwellings, and the city will be rebuilt on her ruins, and their community will be established before me." So there's a couple of interesting things. I know you've heard me talk before about there's the city and there's the community. And the city is the visible, tangible, measurable, and the community is the invisible, intangible, unmeasurable. Well, look, he's brought those two together. The city will be rebuilt. That's the visible, tangible. And the community will be established. And so it comes together because you see, he said, "I'll restore the fortunes of Jacob's tents." That's the tangible, visible. And then the community is made up of these other things like hope, which is intangible, invisible. But if you go back up above there, 3 lines right above community, you see the word hope. That's the 7th word. Mark it. Come down and mark community. That's the 8th word. And then he goes on and says, he picks back up on that theme again. The days are coming. This time he says, the time is coming when I will make a new covenant. And this is the covenant I will make. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. So one thing about this new covenant is it's not chiseled in stone, it's written on hearts. But then he says, essentially it's the same covenant. Look at the next words. I will be their God and they will be my people. And that's the The 9th and 10th word is covenant and heart. And then he says, and if you stay in the land, I will build you up and not tear you down. So you see, he's going back to that original assignment to Jeremiah, but he's saying, but we're back to building up, not tearing down. And I will plant you and not uproot you. And so he's taken, we see 4 of those words that started us in chapter 1 come back at the end and say it wasn't all about destruction and despair. It's full of hope. The hope of, I will build you up, not tear you down, plant you, not uproot you. So, those 10 words that I gave you all to me connect with the covenant. If you think about them all, they all have to do with the covenant, because go all the way back to land. You know, he started by saying, I took you. Remember, he says, when he was taking them, where was he taking them? To the promised land. The land I will give you. And so land has always we've talked about land is both a place and a space, that we can feel like this is my place. This is my space. And he's saying, I'm giving you this special place, this special space. And if you work all the way through it, this covenant gets us back in the glory rather than with worthless idols. It gets us back to the water rather than no water. It gets us back in connection, the branches to the vine. It gets us back saying, I know where to walk. Walk is the journey language for live. And then we move, and so then we move into those, in the bottom, we're now back with hope. And we're back in this community is this community of hope. But it's not a singular community. You'll notice all the way back up in verse 11, the first 3 words that start that second long, dark passage, he says, but my people. These are my people. It's a plural, not my person. It's my people. And he says, my people, that's my community. That's my people who are a community of love and compassion and care for the fatherless and the poor. And then it all comes down to the covenant that I will write on their hearts. And so it's really a covenant of the heart. And the word heart appears in the book of Jeremiah over 60 times. So if you wanted to say, what's the theme of Jeremiah? It's the return of the heart to God's heart. Because sometimes the heart is God's own heart. When he says, my own heart, and sometimes it's the people's heart. Return to me with your heart. Remember, he says, seek me with all your heart. And so the covenant is a covenant of the hearts. And that's what he has given us. So we come to the end of Jeremiah. We come to the end of the 3 major prophets. We've now gone through the books of the law and the books of the prophet. And Jesus has said, when he says, love the Lord your God with all your heart, and love your neighbor as yourself, and on this hang all the law and the prophets. So we have those 2 little 5-word sets from Jesus, and we have these 2 little 5-word sets from God. I will be your God. You will be my people. And so we come to the end of the law and the prophets, we could say. We also come to the end of this year because we're not having class the next 2 Sundays. And I've decided I'm coming to the end of teaching the class. This is a good time. I think it seems like a good ending space. But I just want to say how much Sylvia and I regard all of you, how much we love all of you, how much every Sunday morning to come together and be with you people, you precious brothers and sisters in Christ, for an hour and reflect on God's promises for us, has been a rich, rewarding time for us. And I thank you so much. Thank you.